The road into Yellowstone always feels different. Visitors describe it like stepping into another century where the rules of modern life don't quite apply. Cell signals vanish, conversations hush, and the sheer scale of the forests makes you small in a way few places can. On that morning, the edges of the park were alive with the sound of kids chasing one another around the picnic grounds, their laughter mixing with the rustling of pine needles. Families spread out blankets and hikers tightened their boots before heading up the trailheads. It was an ordinary day at the park's edge until it wasn't. Not far from the picnic area, a small figure stumbled through the brush. At first glance, it could have been a stray dog. Thin legs, unsteady steps, head too big for its body. But the closer you looked, the clearer it became. This was no dog. This was a grizzly bear cub, no more than a few months old, its fur still patchy in places, its black eyes darting with confusion. It wasn't playful or curious, the way cubs usually are when a mother is close. It was alone. And in Yellowstone, that's rarely a good sign. Those who know grizzlies understand that a cub without its mother is a story loaded with questions. Was the sow just out of sight waiting in the trees, or had something worse happened? For rangers, each of those possibilities demanded quick judgment. A mother grizzly is one of the most dangerous animals in North America when she believes her cub is threatened. But a cub wandering alone raises another concern: survival. Without her, his chances were slim. This is the brutal balance of wild animals' beauty and tragedy, bound so tightly together you can't separate one from the other. A woman named Evelyn Hart was the first to notice. She wasn't a tourist, but a park ranger, someone who'd spent years reading Yellowstone's rhythms. She had seen plenty of bears before: big boars lumbering through valleys, sows with twin cubs perched safely at their heels, black bears raiding berry patches near campsites. But this cub wasn't acting right. He wasn't foraging. He wasn't playing. He was moving in tight, nervous circles, letting out short, uncertain grunts. She raised her binoculars, and the realization hit her hard. This wasn't a family out on an afternoon wander. This was an animal on the edge. Nearby, parents began to gather their kids, some pulling them closer, others snapping photos. A few saw a cute animal, a perfect chance for wildlife photography. But Evelyn knew better. This wasn't just a moment for a camera. This was a moment for caution. A cub without a sow is unpredictable, and the possibility of a defensive adult emerging from the trees was real. She stepped forward, waving at the families to back up. That single movement triggered tension in the air. Some laughed nervously, not understanding why she was urgent. Others sensed it immediately. Something was off. That's the thing about wild animals. We want to believe we can read them, that they'll behave like the characters in a documentary or a heartwarming animal rescue clip online. But Yellowstone isn't a controlled set. It's a place where rules are written in instinct and survival. A cub can draw you in with innocence, yet behind him may be a 250-pound mother ready to protect him with her life. Or worse, behind him may be nothing at all. And that silence is its own kind of heartbreak. Calls went out quickly. Standard protocol meant law enforcement was notified, and with law enforcement came canine support. Families overheard bits of radio chatter: possible threat near children bear, cub spotted, containment requested. Each phrase layered on the tension. The sight of uniformed officers stepping out of their SUVs at a place usually reserved for relaxation turned the scene from picnic to something else entirely. What no one expected was that the real story of the afternoon wouldn't be about the grizzly bear cub at all. But before we step into that pause here, imagine being a child in that crowd. One moment you're running between swings, the next you're clutching your parent's hand, while strangers with badges raise their voices. Fear spreads quickly, especially when wild animals are involved. And that's where lessons often emerge, lessons not just for children, but for us all. Danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whimpers. Sometimes it's quiet like a cub circling in confusion. And sometimes what looks dangerous at first glance holds a truth you could never predict. That day in Yellowstone was layered with those contradictions. A wild cub and a picnic. Families searching for peace and officers preparing for confrontation. The kind of contrasts that remind you just how fragile the line between ordinary and extraordinary really is. Evelyn's voice carried across the clearing. "Everyone, step back, please. Give it space." Her calmness belied her racing thoughts. Was this a rescue waiting to happen? Or was it about to spiral into something no one could control? The bear cub paused at the sound of her voice. Ears twitching, nose lifted. For a heartbeat, the meadow was utterly still, and then the silence broke with the low growl of a patrol SUV pulling up. Inside sat Officer Daniel Cole, hands steady on the leash of his partner Ranger, a German shepherd trained for precision obedience and control. Children fell silent at the sight of the canine stepping out. Parents whispered nervously. The cub blinked against the sudden presence of uniform and steel. If you'd been there, you might have thought the story was about to unfold in one direction: a canine and a bear cub, a clash of wild instinct and human command. But Yellowstone doesn't write scripts for us. And Ranger wasn't about to follow the one the officers expected. Because the moment his paws hit the ground, this wasn't just another wildlife rescue. It was the beginning of something that would shake everyone who witnessed it. And it all started with a call that seemed routine, the kind that usually ends with paperwork and caution tape. But this call carried a history no one knew was waiting to be uncovered. The radio crackled the way it always does when something shifts from routine to urgent. A ranger's voice cut through the static. Possible threat North Meadow near the trailhead. A bear cub was sighted close to families, requesting backup. For most park visitors, those words meant little. For officers in the field, they meant only one thing: move now. Officer Daniel Cole had heard 100 calls like it. Usually, it ended with a mother bear shepherding her cubs back into the timber, or rangers setting up a perimeter until the animals wandered off. But this time, something in the voice on the radio made him pause. Rangers didn't often sound rattled, and Evelyn Hart rarely called for more than a vehicle check. She was calm by nature, almost too calm sometimes. If she was asking for backup, there was a reason. He tightened his grip on Ranger's leash. The German shepherd stirred ears, twitching at the static. Ranger had been through these drives before patrol SUVs, gravel roads, sudden stops. He knew the pattern. A door opens, boots hit the ground. Commands. Follow. Dogs like him don't ask questions, they follow orders, or at least that's what everyone believed. The SUV pulled up near the meadow. What Daniel saw first wasn't the cub, it was the crowd. Families clustered together. Phones raised, some nervous, some curious, all too close. This was the danger Evelyn had feared, people forgetting that wild animals, even tiny ones, weren't here for amusement. Evelyn stepped forward quickly. "We've got to clear them back," she said, voice clipped but steady. Daniel scanned the clearing. The grizzly bear cub stood near a fallen log, his body low movements, jerky. Not playful, not secure. The air felt heavy, as though every eye in the clearing was waiting for something to break the silence. Daniel reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we've got one bear cub, no visual on sow. Crowd control needed." He kept his voice even, but the words "no sow" rippled across the scene like cold wind. Everyone knew what that meant. The sow could be just yards away, invisible in the brush, or she could be gone entirely, a reality too grim to linger on. "Do you think he's orphaned?" a woman whispered from behind the caution tape. Evelyn didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cub, as if silence might buy the little animal time. That was when Daniel got the order he'd been half expecting: deploy K9 for containment. It was standard. Dogs like Ranger weren't meant to hurt wildlife unless necessary. They were trained to intimidate, to hold, to control the flow of a situation until human officers could respond. But the image of a German shepherd charging a confused cub was one no officer wanted to see. Still, procedure was procedure. Daniel unclipped the leash and gave Ranger the signal to stand ready. The dog rose instantly, body taut, eyes sharp. Parents pulled their children closer, fear flickering across faces. Some children cried softly, clutching stuffed animals they'd carried from the picnic. Others stared wide-eyed, unsure if they were watching the beginning of a rescue or something they'd never forget for the wrong reasons. It was in moments like these that the truth of wild animals revealed itself. They don't fit neatly into categories cute or dangerous, safe or threatening. They exist in the tension between, and law enforcement is often caught there too, forced to act not only on instinct but on orders. A little boy, maybe 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve. His voice was small, but in the hush it carried, "Mom is the dog, gonna hurt the bear." His mother's hand tightened around his shoulder. She didn't answer. She didn't know. Nearby, another voice broke through. A father older, wearing a cap embroidered with military insignia, spoke low enough for those around him, but loud enough for officers to catch. "That dog's not looking at the cub," he muttered. His tone carried the weight of experience, the kind of recognition only someone who had once trained animals for more than show could hear. He shook his head. "That's not aggression, that's memory." No one responded, but the words hung in the air like a seed waiting to sprout. In law enforcement, in wildlife rescue, in the simple act of standing between children and a bear cub, the question is always the same: follow orders or trust what you see. It's easy to think those two things are the same. They're not. Ranger's body tensed at the command. Daniel's voice was steady, but Ranger hesitated. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his gaze sliding past the cub to something else entirely, the crowd. The leash trembled in Daniel's hand. For the first time in his career, he felt his partner wasn't preparing to act out of training, but out of choice. Training shapes behavior, but memory shapes loyalty. Dogs remember in ways we underestimate, not just sights or sounds, but scents that carry years inside them. To Ranger, the meadow was full of smells most humans couldn't begin to parse: pine sap exhaust fumes, picnic food, the cub's musky fear. But one scent threaded through it all, rising like a forgotten song. That was the beginning. A call about a bear cub. A crowd pressed too close, a ranger doing her best to hold order, a handler ready to obey. Yet none of them knew that this wasn't really about the grizzly cub at all. That little animal was the spark, but the fire was about to reveal something much deeper. In hindsight, Evelyn would describe it best: "I thought we were protecting the families. I thought the cub was the danger, but the truth, the cub was just the mirror. What came next wasn't about the bear, it was about us." And maybe that's the fresh perspective here. We think of animal rescue as saving creatures from danger, but sometimes it's the animals who pull us out of the places we didn't know we were trapped. A cub without a mother, a dog faced with a choice, a man about to be remembered, they were all pieces of the same story. As Ranger lowered his head, the meadow braced for impact, but instead of lunging at the cub, he froze. And in that pause, something began that would silence everyone who stood there. Ranger's muscles coiled as he surged forward. Every parent pulled their children back. Every phone tilted higher. Every breath held. The command had been clear: contain the bear cub. His paws pounded the earth with the certainty of a dog trained to obey without hesitation. But just before he reached the cub, something invisible caught him mid-stride. The shepherd's body shuddered to a halt. His claws dug into the grass, his nose lifted, and a sound slipped out that no one expected: a whine. Low, broken, almost confused. The crowd blinked in disbelief. This was a K9 drilled for precision, a creature who knew only action and command. Yet here he stood still as stone, staring past the trembling grizzly bear cub, as if the little animal had ceased to exist. Daniel Cole yanked the leash. "Ranger, contain." His voice rang sharp, but the dog didn't budge. He sniffed again, ears twitching tail, stiff eyes fixed on something not in front of him, but somewhere behind. The cub, sensing an opening, scuttled closer to the fallen log, curling in on itself. But Ranger's focus wasn't the cub anymore. It was a man. At the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind 2 hikers, stood Michael Ward. His clothes were worn, his hands clutched a faded backpack, and his eyes seemed lost in some private storm. Most people overlooked him, another quiet face on the fringes of Yellowstone's endless flow of visitors. But Ranger's nose told a different story. To humans, scent is fleeting. To dogs, it's memory. Scientists call it olfactory imprinting. One whiff of a scent can last a lifetime in their minds. Ranger inhaled, and what he found wasn't the meadow, or the cub, or the strangers packed tight by the tape. It was years of buried recognition. Sand gun oil, blood. Sweat, the voice of a handler who once knelt beside him in a desert half a world away. He whined again, louder this time. His tail twitched. Daniel felt the leash tremble in his grip. He barked another order, louder, but the shepherd's ears flattened, and his gaze never left Michael. Bystanders murmured. "Why isn't he moving?" Someone asked. The boy whispered. The dog's scared. But an older man, the same veteran from earlier, shook his head. That's not fear. That's remembrance. His words settled like a stone in water, rippling outward through silence. Michael shifted uneasily. He hadn't noticed the dog at first. His attention had been locked on the cub, the officers, the panic swelling around him. But now, as the shepherd's cry rose again, his eyes lifted. For a heartbeat, he looked confused, as if he'd stumbled into someone else's story. Then his lips moved dry and cracked, barely forming a word. "Ranger!" The German shepherd froze, then let out a sound caught between bark and sob. His body softened, his stance lowered. The leash went slack as Daniel staggered at the sudden change. The crowd gasped. The cub tucked itself further under the log, but no one was watching it anymore. All eyes were on the soldier and the dog locked across the clearing. Obedience is powerful, but memory is stronger. A dog can be trained to respond to hundreds of commands, but loyalty, that's something deeper. Loyalty is woven through shared nights under foreign skies, whispered commands in the dark, and the unspoken bond of survival. Ranger stepped forward slowly now, no longer the precise machine of training, but something gentler. He lowered his head, nose sweeping the air, inching toward Michael as if pulling a thread that had been buried for years. Daniel's grip faltered. He glanced at Evelyn, who shook her head slightly, urging him not to interfere. Michael's voice cracked as he tried again. "It's me. It's Mike." He raised a trembling hand, palm open, a gesture both of recognition and surrender. Ranger closed the last feet between them, pressed his nose to Michael's fingers, and inhaled deeply. Then, with the weight of memory crashing through him, the dog let out a long, mournful whine and pressed his head against Michael's chest. Gasps rippled through the meadow. Phones recorded children whispered parents wiped their eyes. Daniel stood frozen, leash dangling uselessly in his hand. Evelyn whispered under her breath, "I've never seen anything like it." To understand this moment, you have to know what scent means to a dog. Studies have shown they can recognize odors across a decade, connecting them instantly to the emotions they carried the first time. For Ranger, Michael's scent was not just sweat and fabric. It was every mission, every patrol, every moment of shelter and trust. It was safety. It was home. Michael staggered back against the crowd, tears blurring his vision. "I thought you were gone," he murmured, voice breaking. "They told me you didn't make it." Ranger's tail moved slowly, then faster, until it wagged with unrestrained relief. He pressed closer, curling into Michael's legs the way a cub might cling to its mother. A canine, dispatched to control a grizzly bear cub, had instead rediscovered the one person he would disobey for. The cub, forgotten for now, watched from its hiding place, a quiet mirror to the reunion unfolding. Both creatures had been separated from what they needed most. One was a wild animal in danger of being orphaned. The other was a soldier who had slipped through the cracks of memory and system alike. Wild animals and people alike can be lost not just in forests, but in the spaces between society's rules. And sometimes recognition, whether through scent or a single whispered name, is what pulls them back. Daniel finally found his voice. "What's happening here?" His words were less commanding than confusing. Evelyn answered softly, not taking her eyes off Michael and Ranger. Something bigger than protocol. The meadow was still. No one reached for Michael. No one pulled Ranger back. For once, Time itself seemed to hold its breath, letting memory have its way. Was this a chance fate? Or simply the science of scent proving that no bond forged in survival ever truly dies? Whichever answer you choose, the effect was undeniable. A man thought lost a dog, thought reassigned a cub, thought alone. Each thread pulled together into a tapestry none of the bystanders would forget. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve again. Mom the dog. He remembers him. And for once she smiled through tears. Yes, he does. But recognition was only the beginning. To understand why Michael had been forgotten and why Ranger had been sent to Yellowstone in the first place, we need to go back to a battlefield 6 years earlier where the bond between them was forged. Michael Ward had been a name once carried on rosters, etched into dog tags and called during morning roll. To those who knew him before, he wasn't the quiet man standing in Yellowstone that day. He was Sergeant Michael Ward, U.S. Army Canine Handler, and beside him always was Ranger. 6 years earlier, their lives had been a blur of desert heat convoys and night patrols. Michael's job wasn't glamorous. It was dirty, punishing work, sweeping roads for IEDs, patrolling perimeters, listening for dangers no human ear could catch. Ranger was trained to sniff out explosives to alert Michael with a shift of posture or a quiet bark that meant life or death. Soldiers trusted dogs like him with everything because their noses could find threats before human eyes ever could. And trust was exactly what bound them. Michael had once told his unit, "I don't move until Ranger says it's safe." He wasn't joking. He'd seen what happened when handlers didn't listen. Out there, trust wasn't optional. It was survival. Then came the blast. His convoy hit a stretch of road that looked no different from the miles behind it. Ranger stiffened, barked low, but before Michael could react, the world erupted. Fire dust, steel, everything hurled into the sky. Michael remembered shielding Ranger with his own body, felt shrapnel bite into his skin, and then nothing. When he opened his eyes again, he was in a hospital far from the desert. The faces around him were strangers. His memory was fractured, as if someone had scattered his life into pieces and left him clutching only fragments. He remembered Ranger's bark, the heat of the sand, and the sound of his men shouting. But names blurred. Dates vanished. And somewhere in the paperwork of a system too big to see him, Michael Ward was marked as gone. Presumed dead. Veterans fall through the cracks every day. Some slip through because of injury, others because of bureaucracy, others still because the trauma is easier to misplace than to face. Michael was all three, with no ID, no clear history, and a brain that betrayed him more often than not. He drifted. One town to the next, shelters, back roads, never staying long enough to belong. And in every place, people saw only the surface, another homeless man with scars he didn't explain. Meanwhile, Ranger had been pulled from the rubble separately. The military retrieved him, patched him up, and reassigned him to law enforcement stateside. No one told the dog his handler was gone. They just gave him a new badge, a new mission, and expected obedience to erase memory. But dogs don't forget, especially not German shepherds trained to anchor their entire world to one person. That's why Yellowstone mattered. It wasn't just about a bear cub cornered in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about two soldiers, one human, one canine, finding each other after the world had written them off. Evelyn, still watching, understood better than most. Her father had been a veteran too, one who came home with medals, but also nightmares. She'd grown up knowing that war didn't always end when the uniform came off. Seeing Michael in that meadow, clutching his backpack like a shield, she recognized the signs, the hollow stare, the trembling hands, the way his voice cracked on his own name. War doesn't only break bodies, it breaks continuity. One day you're needed more than anyone. The next day you're forgotten. And often it isn't malice, it's a system too busy counting forms to count lives. Michael lowered himself onto the grass. Ranger pressed against him. His voice was hoarse, but every word bled with relief. "I called for you in the smoke," he whispered. "I thought you didn't make it." Ranger nuzzled closer. A low huff vibrating from his chest, the same sound he used to make in their bunker when the desert night pressed too heavily. The cub still curled near the log, lifted its head, and let out a soft bleat. The sound cut through the moment, strange and fitting all at once. Another survivor, another soul left without what it needed most. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone watching. Two orphans, one human, one wild animal bound by absence. And maybe that's the fresh perspective worth holding, and we measure survival by breath, by heartbeat, by movement. But real survival is remembering who you are, even when the world forgets. Michael had been erased on paper, but here in Ranger's recognition, his identity returned. Parents clutched their kids tighter. Some wept openly. A woman murmured, "He's not homeless, he's a soldier." A man whispered, "That dog just proved it." Science can explain parts of this. Dogs can smell and recall scents years after separation. They can recognize handlers by a single cue even after being retrained. But science can't explain why Ranger chose that moment to resist orders, why he broke protocol in front of everyone. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was both. Daniel Cole, leash slack in his hand, stood torn between duty and awe. He'd trained Ranger, fed him, and trusted him on patrol. But looking at Michael, he realized he wasn't the first home the shepherd had ever known. He was second, and that mattered. This is where compassion begins, when you realize you're not the center of the story. Daniel could have yanked Ranger back, forced him to finish his task, and followed the manual. Instead, he took a step back, letting a man and his dog rewrite the scene without interference. For Michael, recognition didn't erase the scars. His memory gaps were still there. His trauma hadn't vanished, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. Someone, not a person but a dog, had remembered him when the rest of the world hadn't. And that's what broke the crowd. They weren't just watching a reunion. They were watching proof that loyalty doesn't dissolve in silence, that bonds, forged in hardship, outlast even the most brutal attempts to sever them. The grizzly bear cub shuffled uncertainly, stepping into the open again. No one moved to chase it off. For once, humans understood that sometimes wild animals don't need interference. Sometimes they just need space. The cub glanced at Michael and Ranger, then ambled toward the tree line, disappearing into the forest where its story would continue unseen. That too was a reminder, not every rescue looks the way we imagine. Sometimes the wild saves itself. Sometimes the saving is for us. But recognition alone wasn't enough. Ranger had chosen Michael, yes. But the system had rules, and those rules weren't ready for what came next. Because in law enforcement, loyalty can't outweigh orders unless hearts are willing to change. The meadow was silent, except for the sound of Ranger's breathing. Daniel Cole tightened the leash again, trying to steady his voice. Ranger, contain. It was the command he had given 100 times in training, the command that never failed. But the dog didn't move. His chest rose and fell, ears, twitching eyes locked on Michael as though nothing else existed. For the first time in his career, Daniel felt powerless. He knew the manuals, the drills, the way a canine's body should respond in perfect sync to the handler's orders. Yet here he stood, leash limp in his hand, watching loyalty rewrite the rules. The crowd leaned closer, phones glowing, children clutching parents' arms. Evelyn Hart whispered, "He's not choosing the cub. He's choosing him." The cub, forgotten by most now, shuffled toward the log, again curling into safety. In any other situation, it would have been the center of the story. A grizzly bear cub alone near families always made headlines. But today, the wild animal was only a backdrop to something no one expected, a service dog defying duty for love. Daniel called again, sharper this time. Ranger. The shepherd whined, pressed closer to Michael, and sat firmly at his side. The decision was clear. He wasn't moving. Training can prepare for every scenario, but one the moment loyalty collides with protocol. Dogs like Ranger are drilled endlessly. Bite, hold, search, release. Their purpose is clarity, not hesitation, but training doesn't erase memory. It doesn't erase the scent of a man who once shielded you from fire. who whispered your name in smoke. Michael's hand shook as he stroked Ranger's fur, voice unsteady. "You're still mine," he whispered. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition spoken as if reminding himself. Supervisors on scene exchanged urgent looks. Radios crackled, the canines failing to comply. "Do we need replacement containment orders?" clashed with disbelief. No one had a protocol for this. One officer muttered, "He's out of control." But another shook her head. "No, he's in control of exactly what matters." This moment carried a lesson worth pausing on. We live in systems built on rules. Rules keep us safe, predictable, aligned. But rules also assume life will fit into categories. The wild doesn't obey categories. And sometimes neither do people or animals. Loyalty isn't measured in checklists, it's measured in choice. The boy who had asked earlier if the dog would hurt the cub spoke again. Voice trembling but sure. He remembers. His mother tried to hush him, but the words had already taken root. Others nodded, tears in their eyes. People who came expecting a picnic were witnessing devotion that training couldn't erase. Science gives us a frame German shepherds can distinguish thousands of scents, each tied to memory. But no study can capture what unfolded there, a dog refusing to attack, not out of confusion, but out of love stronger than orders. Daniel's radio buzzed with pressure from above. "Control your canine, officer. That's an order." His throat tightened. He looked at Michael, looked at Ranger, pressed against him, and for the first time Daniel hesitated. To pull Ranger away would mean tearing apart something sacred. To force obedience here would betray the very reason humans trusted dogs with their lives in the first place. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, look around. That dog isn't failing. He's remembering." She pointed toward the crowd, parents in tears, children whispering, strangers frozen. "You can't train that. You can't order it away." Michael whispered again. "I thought you were gone." Ranger whimpered low, pressing his head harder into Michael's lap. And maybe that's the fresh perspective. Discipline is powerful, but devotion is stronger. A cub survives not by following orders, but by clinging to the bond with its mother. A veteran survives not by rules alone, but by the unseen tether to those who stood beside him. Ranger survived because of Michael. And now Michael survived because Ranger hadn't forgotten. Supervisors argued in hushed tones. Some insisted the cane had compromised safety. Others, visibly moved, shook their heads. One officer muttered, "Protocol doesn't cover this." The bear cub let out a soft cry and disappeared into the trees. For once, no one chased it, no one tried to intervene. The wild would find its own way. The real story was happening in plain sight at the feet of a soldier, once forgotten. Daniel finally lowered the radio. "Dispatch," he said slowly. "Kine will not re-engage. Situation is under control." His words were careful, but his eyes said more. Sometimes control means letting go. Obedience makes machines. Loyalty makes family. And Ranger had made his choice. The meadow was still. The veteran in the crowd wiped his eyes, whispering to no one in particular. That dog's doing what every soldier hopes for finding home. For Michael, the reunion wasn't neat. His memory is still fractured, his scars still burned, but the dog's presence pulled pieces back together. In that moment, he wasn't homeless, forgotten, or erased. He was Sergeant Ward again, the handler of Ranger. For the crowd, it was a revelation. What began as fear of a bear cub turned into awe at loyalty's power. Phones captured it all, but no video could hold the weight of being there. And maybe that's what makes this story timeless. In a world obsessed with rules, paperwork, and orders, one German shepherd reminded everyone that loyalty sometimes demands disobedience. But loyalty alone couldn't settle the question. Ranger had chosen Michael, yes. Yet the system had responsibilities, policies, and a badge that still bound the dog to duty. What happened next would pit compassion against bureaucracy, and the world was about to watch. The meadow didn't stay quiet for long. Radios buzzed, boots shifted, and the chain of command caught up with what had just unfolded. To the families watching, it was a miracle. To the supervisors arriving on scene, it was a problem. The canine had ignored orders. A handler had hesitated. A grizzly bear cub had slipped back into the forest. Nothing about this moment fit neatly into the manuals. A senior officer stepped forward, voice low but firm. "This isn't protocol. That dog is still on active duty. He doesn't get to choose. He was right, technically." Ranger carried a badge. His training represented thousands of hours and dollars. He wasn't a pet, not in the eyes of the system. He was a working dog, bound by rules, as strict as any officer, but the crowd had seen something else. They hadn't witnessed failure. They'd witnessed love. A boy whispered. He found his person. A woman cried openly, clutching her daughter. Videos streamed online within minutes, captions already spreading. K9 reunites with long-lost handler. Evelyn spoke quietly to the commander. "Sir, with respect, if you try to pull them apart, now you'll break more than orders. You'll break trust with the public, with the people watching this moment unfold." She wasn't trying to be dramatic. She was speaking the truth. This is the crux of law enforcement work, balancing protocol with judgment. Rules protect officers, protect the public, and protect the animals caught in human spaces. But rules are written for predictability. Life, and especially wild animals, rarely follow predictable paths. Years ago, a black bear wandered into a Montana neighborhood. The protocol said tranquilize, relocate, and file the report. But a young officer noticed the cubs in the trees nearby, and instead of sedation, they gave the sow a path out. The family reunited in the woods that night. Technically, the officer broke the book. Practically, they saved lives. Sometimes compassion isn't the opposite of order. It's the completion of it. Rules exist to keep us safe. Compassion exists to keep us human. Still, not everyone agreed. Supervisors huddled, debating liability. "What precedent does this set?" one asked. "If we let a canine choose what happens next time, what if he refuses again in a real emergency?" The questions weren't wrong. They were the kind of leaders who had to ask, but they missed the point that the crowd already understood. The point was that Ranger wasn't refusing safety. He was redefining it. By now, news vans were already rolling toward the park. Clips were hitting national feeds, the shepherd leaning into Michael, the cub scurrying away, the crowd in tears. Hashtags sprouted. Talk shows lined up guests. Within hours, the debate wasn't just about a dog and a veteran. It was about what animals mean to us and what we owe to those who serve both human and canine. Commentators asked, should service dogs be considered veterans too? Should they have the right to retire with dignity rather than be reassigned until their bodies give out? Animal sanctuaries and veteran groups weighed in. Wildlife rescue organizations added their voice, pointing out that just as wild animals deserve space to survive, service animals deserve compassion when their service leads them home again. Michael sat quietly through all of it, one hand on Ranger's neck, the other clutched tight around his pack. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was proof enough. A forgotten soldier, a lost dog, a bond reforged in the open. From the crowd, the veteran who had spoken earlier stepped forward. His voice shook but carried weight. I served too. I know what it's like to come home invisible. That man isn't invisible anymore. Don't take that from him. His words cut through bureaucracy like a blade. And maybe that's the fresh perspective. Systems aren't cruel because they mean to be. They're cruel because they forget the faces behind the forms. Today, the faces were undeniable. Supervisors argued a little longer, but the tide was already turning. The cane officer who had trained Ranger finally spoke, loosening his grip on the leash. He's not mine anymore, he said softly. He made his choice. With that, he let the leash drop, a gesture both simple and monumental. The meadow erupted in cheers. Parents clapped. Children laughed through tears. Even Evelyn let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For once, compassion outweighed caution. For once, the system bent toward mercy. Later that evening, as officials gathered around Michael, the debate wasn't over. Paperwork still had to be filed. Reviews would still happen. But the decision, at least for now, was made not on paper, but in hearts. Ranger would stay with Michael. That decision carried weight far beyond Yellowstone. News anchors replayed the clip under headlines about loyalty and survival. Editorials questioned how many other veterans like Michael had been lost in the shuffle. Animal rights advocates demanded reforms for working dogs. Families who had been at the meadow told friends and neighbors what they had seen, their voices carrying the story farther than any broadcast could. Compassion isn't weakness. Compassion is a strength that refuses to be silenced by fear. Systems are built to say no. But progress comes when enough people say yes. As for the grizzly bear cub, no one saw it again that day. But in a way, its presence was the silent anchor of the story. The cub was the spark that drew officers, families, and one forgotten veteran together. Its vulnerability mirrored Michael's. Its survival reminded everyone that wild animals live on the edge of human choices just as soldiers do when the battlefield ends. The cub wasn't rescued in the traditional sense. No ranger scooped it up. No sanctuary claimed it. But sometimes wildlife rescue doesn't mean intervention. Sometimes it means leaving space for the wild to heal itself. That perspective shifted the way many saw Yellowstone. Visitors began to understand that behind every quiet meadow might be a story not of danger, but of survival and connection between humans, animals, and the fragile lines that hold us together. But even as the system bent, the story wasn't finished. Michael and Ranger still had to find a way forward, not as Soldier and Kay, not as forgotten and reassigned, but as two survivors learning how to live again. In the days after the meadow, headlines traveled faster than Michael could keep up with. News anchors called it miraculous. Wildlife enthusiasts debated the symbolism of a grizzly bear cub crossing paths with a forgotten soldier. Social media is filled with images of Ranger pressed against Michael's chest. Some called it a rescue, others called it destiny. Michael called it simply survival. But survival alone wasn't enough. For the first time in years, he had someone at his side again. Someone who remembered him when even his own memory had failed. The question became, what do two survivors do when the world finally stops erasing them? Veterans groups stepped in first. They found Michael's space in a small community home near Bozeman, Montana, where others who had served were piecing lives back together. The place wasn't fancy, simple rooms, a shared kitchen, and a yard big enough for a German shepherd to stretch his legs. But for Michael, it was more than he had dared to hope for. For Ranger, it was freedom with purpose. The first morning there, Michael woke to find Ranger already sitting by the door waiting for a walk. The simple routine pulled him into rhythm again. Leash boots, gravel paths lined with pine. As they moved, neighbors waved. Children from nearby houses ran out with treats. One boy, the same child who had whispered, he remembers in the meadow, brought a ball and asked shyly, "Can I throw it?" Ranger fetched it with joy-tail high. It was in those small actions that healing began. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in ordinary kindness. A cup of coffee handed to Michael by another veteran ranger, curling up beside him during restless nights. Staff members who didn't flinch when his voice cracked, telling fragments of his story. Here's an example worth noting. One evening, a group of veterans gathered in the yard. Some had never spoken openly about their experiences. But watching Michael and Ranger together loosened something in them. A Marine with deep lines on his face said quietly, "I had a dog too. He didn't make it home." Another nodded. Seeing them like this, it feels like a part of us is still out there. Words that had been locked away for years spilled into the open, drawn out by the silent presence of a shepherd lying at Michael's feet. Healing rarely comes head-on. It comes sideways, through laughter at a ball game, through shared silence in a yard, through the steady weight of a dog's head on your knee. The grizzly bear cub wasn't forgotten either. Rangers searched for signs, hoping it had reunited with its mother. No one could say for sure. But its brief appearance carried a lasting impact. Families who had been there told their children about the cub for weeks. Teachers used the story in classrooms to explain how wild animals survive when humans choose not to interfere. For many kids, that day was their first lesson that not all rescues look like cages or tranquilizers. Sometimes the best animal rescue is simply stepping aside and letting the forest do what it has always done. For Michael, the cub became a quiet symbol. He was lost too, he told Evelyn when she visited him weeks later. Maybe he found his way back. Maybe I did too. Ranger, though officially retired from active duty, still carried his discipline. He responded to commands, sat alert when strangers approached, and guarded Michael in small protective ways. But he was changing. His growl softened into sighs when children hugged him. His stiff stance melted into wagging tails during visits from neighborhood families. He wasn't just a canine anymore. He was once again simply Ranger. Retirement for service animals isn't about losing purpose. It's about finding a new purpose. Just as veterans need space to heal into new lives, so do the animals who served beside them. Both deserve more than a file closed and a badge reassigned. Both deserve sanctuary, not only in facilities but in hearts. Public debate grew. Should canines be formally honored at retirement? Should they be paired with their original handlers whenever possible? Should communities treat them not as tools but as fellow veterans? These weren't just abstract questions anymore. They were shaped by the image of Ranger refusing an order, choosing love over command, and reminding the nation what loyalty means. Michael often sat quietly with him in the evenings, listening to the world go by. "We were both supposed to be gone," he'd whisper, stroking the shepherd's fur, "but here we are." Ranger would nuzzle close, a living reminder that forgotten doesn't always mean lost. Healing, though, wasn't instant. Michael's memory still faltered. Some nights he woke sweating, trapped in deserts that no longer existed. But Ranger was always there, pressing close, grounding him in the present. Staff noticed Michael slept longer, laughed more, and even gained weight he had lost during years on the margins. The presence of his dog stitched together cracks no medicine had touched. Wildlife and veterans share more than most realize. Both can be endangered by neglect. Both can disappear quietly if no one notices. And both can recover when compassion steps in, not always with grand gestures, but with consistent presence. One Saturday, the community held a small event. Children came with drawings of Ranger and Michael veterans, shared stories, and a local wildlife rescue group spoke about protecting bear cubs and other forest animals. It wasn't official, no medals or ribbons, but to Michael it felt more important than any ceremony. For the first time in years, he wasn't on the outside looking in. He was part of something again. The story reached beyond Montana. Letters arrived from strangers, families who had lost pets, soldiers who had lost comrades, even children who wrote simply, "Thank you for loving your dog." Michael read each one slowly, tears often falling before he finished. He kept them in a shoebox, the same box where he placed Ranger's new collar engraved not with a badge but with his name. And maybe that's the final lesson of this chapter. Healing isn't the erasure of scars. It's the weaving of scars into a story worth telling. Michael and Ranger weren't unbroken. They were living proof that broken things can still build something whole. As summer turned to autumn, the forest around the community shifted colors. On crisp mornings, Michael walked with Ranger past rows of veterans' flags and out to the quiet fields. He would pause sometimes, looking at the horizon. Ranger would sit beside him, watchful and calm. Both knew they were no longer alone, but healing together was only the beginning. What came next wasn't about headlines or policies. It was about the quiet moments and one final image that would show the world what loyalty, survival, and love truly look like. The first light of dawn crept across the Montana horizon, soft and gold against the peaks. Michael walked slowly, his boots crunching the frosted grass, Ranger steady at his side. They reached a quiet spot overlooking the valley, where a row of flags marked the community's small memorial wall. Michael stopped, pressed his hand against the cool stone, and let the silence speak. Ranger leaned against his leg, head resting on his knee. It wasn't a ceremony. There were no cameras, no uniforms, no speeches. Just a man and his dog standing in the stillness, two survivors honoring what they had lost and what they had found. Michael whispered almost to himself, "We made it back." Ranger gave a low huff, a sound of agreement, the same sound he had once made in desert nights to remind Michael he wasn't alone. That single image, a forgotten soldier and a retired canine reunited standing together before a wall of names, carried a weight deeper than any headline. It wasn't about rules broken or protocols rewritten. It was about loyalty that outlasted war, homelessness, bureaucracy, and even memory itself. The grizzly bear cub had long since disappeared into Yellowstone's wilderness, but its shadow lingered. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Children still asked about it during school visits, and teachers used it to explain how wild animals survive when humans give them space. For Michael, the cub became a symbol he carried with him. "That cub was lost same as me," he said once. "But the forest gave him another chance. Ranger gave me mine." And maybe that's the lesson here sometimes. Rescue doesn't look like cages or tranquilizers. Sometimes it looks like loyalty, like space, like a quiet refusal to forget. Veteran advocates began pointing to Michael's story as proof of what too often goes unseen: men and women who return from service only to vanish in plain sight, slipping between the cracks. They argued that just as endangered animals need protection to survive, so do forgotten veterans. Communities listened. Conversations sparked. Healing didn't stop at Michael's door. It rippled outward. Animal advocates raised their voices too. They pointed to Ranger as evidence that service dogs are more than tools of law enforcement. They are partners, brothers in arms, souls capable of memory and choice. Wildlife rescue groups drew parallels between the cub and the king, both deserving sanctuary when their work of survival demanded rest. The public saw it plainly: if we honor wild animals for their resilience, we must honor service animals for theirs. If we create sanctuaries for grizzly bears and black bears, why not for the shepherds who've walked patrol lines and guarded human lives? Michael often received letters from strangers. One child read, "When I grow up, I want to be like Ranger because he didn't forget his friend." Another from a veteran in another state, "Your story reminded me I'm not invisible." These letters filled a shoebox in Michael's room, a small treasure chest of reminders that loyalty doesn't die quietly. We spend so much time measuring strength by power, by obedience, by results. But real strength is in loyalty that time and trauma cannot erase. Real survival is in remembering who matters most, even when the world tells you to move on. Studies show dogs can recognize a scent after years apart, linking it instantly to the emotions of their first imprint. Neuroscientists confirm what Michael already knew, that memory is stitched into the body as much as the mind. Ranger's refusal to attack that bear cub wasn't a failure. It was the deepest kind of remembrance, a truth written in scent, heart, and survival. The image of Michael and Ranger visiting the memorial wall spread quietly too. A photo taken by a passerby made its way online. The soldier's bowed head, the dog pressed close. It didn't go viral like the meadow scene. It didn't need to. It lived in quieter spaces, in veterans' newsletters, in community bulletins, in animal sanctuary campaigns. It was no longer a spectacle. It was testimony. The small veteran community around them changed as well. Men and women who hadn't spoken about their scars began to. Families who had struggled to understand PTSD found language in Michael's story. Children who once feared wild animals now asked questions about coexistence, about grizzly bears, about why a cub alone mattered. Healing was no longer just personal. It was communal. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. Every person watching this story unfold has to decide what to carry away. Will we see wild animals as threats or as reminders of survival? Will we see forgotten veterans as invisible, or as voices worth listening to? Will we see service dogs as tools or as partners who deserve dignity? That's the mystery and beauty of stories like this. They aren't about one cub, one soldier, one shepherd. They are about all of us. About the ways we choose loyalty over rules, compassion over convenience, remembrance over erasure. Michael and Ranger now walk daily, their pace unhurried, their bond unbreakable. Each step is a quiet declaration we are still here. We are not forgotten. In a world that often measures worth by usefulness, love refuses to be reduced. Loyalty refuses to be silenced. Survival refuses to be forgotten. Now I want to turn this moment toward you. Think about the people or animals in your life who have carried you, protected you, or simply refused to forget you when others did. Ask yourself, who would you be without them? And who could you choose to stand beside the way Ranger stood by Michael? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of loyalty, of compassion, of the quiet power of survival, I invite you to join us here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might need to be reminded that loyalty never fades. Together, we can keep telling the stories of wild animals, veterans, and bonds that refuse to break.